At 5 a.m. on the morning of January 11th, 1945, Major William Shomo crouched in the cockpit of his Mustang, watching 13 enemy shapes materialize out of the overcast sky above Luzon. He was 2,000 feet above the jungle canopy, suspended in a layer of gray mist that felt more like a graveyard than a battlefield. Below him, the Philippines were burning, while above him, the Japanese Empire was proving it was not dead yet. Shomo squinted through the plexiglass to see a massive Betty bomber, fat and slow, painted in the dark green of the Imperial Navy. But the bomber was not alone, because it was surrounded by a swarm of 12 fighter planes, Tonys and Toyos, buzzing around their queen like angry wasps protecting a hive. Shomo looked at the odds and realized it was simple arithmetic that would make any sane man turn his nose toward home. There were 13 of them, and there were only 2 of him. Shomo had his wingman, Lieutenant Paul Lipscomb, flying tight on his flank, but that was it. 2 American planes against an entire Japanese squadron was a death sentence. And to make matters worse, Shomo was not supposed to be there to fight, because he was not flying a standard fighter plane. He was flying a photo-reconnaissance ship, a machine built to run away, not to stand and brawl. The manual on his knee was very specific about situations like this, stating that when a reconnaissance pilot sees a superior enemy force, he uses his speed to survive. He does not engage, he does not attack, he takes his pictures, and he gets the hell out of Dodge. For 3 years, men like Shomo had been the laughingstock of the Army Air Forces. The real fighter pilots, the ones flying the P-38s and the P-47s, had a special name for the reconnaissance boys. They called them tourists or the Kodak kids. In the officer clubs back at base, the fighter jocks would slam their beers on the bar and brag about their kills, about the Messerschmitts they blew out of the sky or the Zeros they turned into fireballs. When a recon pilot walked in, the room would go quiet, or worse, the jokes would start. The fighter pilots would ask if the tourists had seen any nice scenery today, or if they had taken any pretty snapshots for the scrapbook. It was a humiliation that dug deep under the skin, because the implication was clear. The fighter pilots were the warriors, the knights of the air who did the killing and the dying, while the recon pilots were just spectators. They were the guys who watched the war happen from a safe distance, and were the ones who carried cameras instead of courage. Shomo hated that label, and he hated the way the other pilots looked at his plane, tapping the glass windows on the fuselage where the cameras lived, treating his machine like it was a toy instead of a weapon. He knew the truth that the loudmouths at the bar ignored, which was that flying recon was not safe. It was a suicide mission with a notepad where you had to fly low, straight into the teeth of the enemy anti-aircraft guns, to get the photos the generals needed. You had to fly steady and level while people shot at you, because if you jinked or rolled, the photos would come out blurry and the mission would be a failure. And the plane itself was part of the problem, because Shomo was flying an F-6D. On the outside, it looked exactly like the legendary P-51 Mustang that was tearing up the skies over Germany and Japan. It had the same Merlin engine, the same beautiful lines, and the same propeller that could drag the airframe through the sky at 400 miles per hour. But under the skin, it was a different beast entirely. The Army had ripped out the main fuel tank behind the pilot's seat to make room for the massive, heavy camera equipment. They installed K-17 and K-22 cameras, big industrial machines full of glass lenses and steel gears, and cut holes in the fuselage for the lenses to peek out. This meant the F-6D was heavy, tail-heavy, and sluggish compared to a pure fighter. It flew like a racehorse carrying a bag of cement, so when you pulled back on the stick to climb, the weight of the cameras dragged you down. When you tried to turn tight in a dogfight, the balance was all wrong because the plane was designed to be a flying eye, not a flying gun. Sure, it still had the 6.50 caliber machine guns in the wings, but most commanders saw those as defensive weapons that were there to scare people off while you ran away. They were not meant for hunting, and although Shomo had spent the last few months proving them by picking off stray targets here and there, the stigma remained. He was just a tourist, just a guy taking pictures of the war while the real men fought it. On this particular morning, January 11th, Shomo was sick of it. He was a man who understood death better than most because before the war, back in Pennsylvania, William Shomo had not been a college athlete or a race car driver. He had been a mortician. He was an undertaker who spent his days preparing bodies for burial. dealing with the cold reality of the end of life. The other pilots called him the Flying Undertaker, and the nickname fit because he had a dark, quiet intensity about him. He didn't brag at the bar, nor use his hands to fly air battles in the mess hall. He just watched, and he waited with a patience that came from a profession where rushing led to mistakes. The mission that morning was supposed to be a milk run, which was pilot slang for a job so easy a baby could do it. Shomo and Lipscomb were ordered to fly north from their base in Mindoro and check the weather over the Tajidro airfield. The generals were planning a bombing raid, and they needed to know if the clouds were too thick for the bombers to see the targets. It was the kind of dull assignment that perfectly fit the reputation of a reconnaissance crew. Fly up, check the cloud cover, maybe photograph the runway, then head back and make it to the mess hall before noon. That was the expectation. But the moment they crossed into hostile airspace, the routine evaporated. Shomo caught sight of the Japanese formation off his left side, sliding beneath the cloud layer. The enemy aircraft were moving in a loose, overconfident pattern. They had numbers. They were over their own territory. From their perspective, there was no threat. To them, the two American aircraft in the distance were probably just more reconnaissance planes doing what they always did in that sector: observe and retreat. The lead pilot in the Betty bomber likely felt no urgency at all. With 12 fighters circling his protection, he could afford to relax. Shomo quickly scanned his instruments. Fuel levels were steady. Engine temperature was within limits. Everything was in the green. He glanced toward Lieutenant Paul Lipscomb, who maintained position and waited for direction. Lipscomb was dependable, disciplined. But this was not a situation anyone had trained for. Every rule, every briefing, every tactical chart would call this suicide. Two aircraft, burdened with camera equipment, attacking a bomber shielded by 12 fighters defied basic arithmetic. The sensible move was obvious. Advance the throttle, drop altitude, and use the Mustang's speed to disappear into the clouds. They could radio the coordinates and allow a full squadron of P-38s to handle the engagement. That was the logical course. That was the reconnaissance solution. But Shomo studied the formation again and noticed flaws. The fighters were drifting too wide. No one was checking behind them. They were flying as if the outcome of the war had already been decided. Or perhaps they simply dismissed the two distant American aircraft as harmless. They saw the camera ports and assumed there was no threat. To them, he was the same joke the fighter pilots at the bar had made him into. A tourist, a spectator, a man with cameras instead of aggression. They were already counting him as prey. Something hardened inside him. The shift was cold and immediate. He stopped seeing airplanes. He saw targets. He reached down and snapped open the guard over his gun switch. The gun sight illuminated, the reticle glowing against the glass. He pressed the microphone key on his throttle. His voice carried no excitement, no fear, only decision. "Stay with me, Lipscomb. We are going down." He pushed the control stick forward. The nose of the F-6D dropped toward the jungle. The engine thundered as the propeller clawed at the heavy, humid air. Acceleration built quickly. The reconnaissance pilot was finished observing. The cameras behind him were nothing but excess weight now. Major William Shomo was diving straight into 13 enemy aircraft, and he had already decided how this would end. The manuals called it suicide. The experts called it impossible. Shomo called it necessary. The descent was not smooth. When he forced the stick forward, the aircraft did not glide gracefully. It plunged. The K-17 and K-22 cameras in the rear of the fuselage pulled at the aircraft like an anchor. The Mustang shook as the airspeed indicator swept past 300 miles per hour, then 350, then 400. The Merlin engine howled at full strain, the propeller tearing into the thick air. Inside the cockpit, the noise was overwhelming. It was not the steady hum of routine flight. It was mechanical violence. The pressure of the dive forced him back into his seat, shoulder straps biting into his body. Blood drained from his head. His vision narrowed until only one image remained clear, the tail of the Japanese formation. He was attacking from above and behind, the classic surprise position. But normally, that maneuver was executed by an entire squadron coordinating their timing. This time it was one heavily loaded reconnaissance Mustang dropping out of the sky alone. The Japanese fighters held a relaxed V around the Betty bomber. They continued straight and level, unaware that danger was closing at nearly 450 miles per hour. They looked exposed, vulnerable. Shomo selected his first target, a Kawasaki Ki-61, known to Allied pilots as the Tony. It was a sleek, dangerous aircraft with a liquid-cooled engine that gave it the profile of a German fighter. The Tony on the right edge of the formation had drifted slightly away from the group. It was isolated. Shomo adjusted his angle of descent, aligning the nose of his Mustang directly with the enemy's tail. The distance collapsed quickly. 500 yards. 400 yards. He did not fire. Patience had been part of his life long before the war. He intended to close until there was no margin for error. He wanted to see the surface of the enemy aircraft clearly before he squeezed the trigger. At 300 yards, the Japanese pilot sensed something. Perhaps he caught a flash of silver in his mirror. Perhaps he felt the disturbance in the air. The Tony rolled slightly left and began a shallow turn to investigate. That small movement exposed the underside of the aircraft. Its broad belly filled Shomo's gun sight. Shomo pressed the trigger. All 650 caliber machine guns exploded to life at once. The sound was not a single crack. It was a brutal mechanical tearing, like steel ripping through concrete. The Mustang vibrated under the recoil, the drag of the gunfire biting into his speed. Streams of tracers stretched forward from his wings, bright lines stitching him to the Tony ahead. The rounds did not simply strike the Japanese fighter. They shredded it. A 50 caliber projectile, thick as a man's thumb and traveling close to 3,000 feet per second, does not leave neat punctures in aluminum. It tears it open. Shomo walked his fire forward, starting at the tail, climbing through the fuselage, and driving into the cockpit and engine. The Tony jolted violently. Fragments of canopy glass burst away into the slipstream. A moment later, fuel ignited inside the wings. There was no dramatic blast, only a sudden flare of orange that swallowed the aircraft. The fighter flipped onto its back and dropped away, tumbling out of formation. Shomo did not follow it with his eyes. He was already hauling back on the stick, converting the speed of his dive into altitude. 1 destroyed, 12 remaining. The surprise was finished, but confusion had just begun. The Japanese pilots saw the burning wreck and the silver flash of the American aircraft climbing past. Instead of reacting with discipline, they scattered. Formation dissolved. Aircraft peeled away in every direction. They could see one Mustang, but logic told them there had to be more. No pilot attacked a formation like that alone. They craned their necks, searching the clouds for the rest of a squadron that did not exist. Shomo used the disorder immediately. At the top of his climb, he kicked rudder, forcing the heavy nose around. The camera equipment in the rear protested under the strain. This was far from the gentle, straight flight those systems were built for. The engineers had designed lenses and mirrors for steady lines, not violent combat maneuvers. Shomo threw the aircraft around regardless. If the cameras shattered, he would deal with it later. If he did not survive, it would not matter. He found his second target. Another Tony had broken left and was trying to climb, showing its exhaust stacks and engine to him. The Japanese pilot was attempting to build energy, but he did not have enough speed. Shomo rolled inverted and dropped again. This time he lacked the altitude margin he had enjoyed before, but he still carried momentum. He descended on the fighter so quickly it seemed almost stationary. Closing inside 40 yards, a distance closer to pistol range than aerial combat, he could clearly see the pilot inside. He fired a short burst, less than a second. It was precise, controlled. He did not waste ammunition. The stream of rounds sliced through the right wing. The structure failed instantly. The wing bent upward, then tore free, and the aircraft snapped into a flat spin. Centrifugal force would trap the pilot inside, pinning him against the side of the cockpit as the fighter spiraled down into the jungle. 2 destroyed. By now, Lipscomb had joined the engagement, doing his best to follow his leader. But the pace was relentless. Shomo was no longer flying according to doctrine. He was moving by instinct. He dove and climbed repeatedly, building speed with the sheer mass of his aircraft. The Japanese fighters were agile, capable of tight turns. The Mustang was something else entirely. It was raw velocity, a heavy machine accelerating through the sky. If he maintained speed, they could not match him. But the weakness of the reconnaissance configuration was beginning to show. The extra weight in the tail made every recovery from a dive more difficult. Each time he pulled up, the aircraft resisted. The control stick felt heavier. His arm strained against it. He was forcing several tons of metal and fuel away from the ground. On the second pullout, he had to grip the stick with both hands. G-forces pressed down on him as he fought to level the aircraft. He clenched his jaw until the horizon steadied. He searched for the bomber again. The Betty was still there, lumbering in the center of the chaos. The remaining Japanese fighters were regaining control. Panic was fading, replaced by anger. They began tightening back toward the bomber, trying to rebuild a defensive wall. They intended to trap him, to slow him, and then use their superior turning performance to get behind him and tear him apart. Shomo spotted 3 Nakajima Ki-44 fighters, known as Toyos, positioning themselves to intercept. The Tojo was not a minor threat. It was fast, climbed aggressively, and carried heavy cannons. The pilots flying them did not break away. They turned directly toward him. It was a challenge. 3 fighters armed with cannons against 1 Mustang armed with machine guns. The numbers were not favorable. Every manual would advise disengagement. He had already shot down 2 enemy aircraft. He had disrupted the formation. He was still alive. He could dive away now, push the throttle forward, and be back over friendly territory within 20 minutes. He would return with 2 confirmed victories and a story no one would question. Surviving that encounter alone would earn respect. No one would have faulted him for leaving. In fact, they would likely decorate him for it. He could have returned to base, walked into the officers' club, and finally met the fighter pilots eye to eye. But that was not what occupied his mind. His focus was locked on the bomber. The Betty was enormous, a slow-moving reservoir of fuel and explosives. That was the objective. The 3 Toyos between him and that aircraft were simply obstacles. He glanced at his ammunition counters. Plenty remaining. Fuel gauges. Still sufficient. He searched for fear and found none. Only a cold, methodical concentration. He did not turn away. He advanced the throttle past its normal limit and engaged war emergency power. Manifold pressure spiked. The Merlin engine howled under the strain, black smoke trailing from the exhaust stacks as the Mustang lunged forward. He aimed directly at the lead Tojo. The Japanese pilot fired first. Smoke flashed from the fighter's wings as heavy shells streaked past Shomo's canopy, glowing projectiles slicing through the air. One direct hit would have torn his aircraft apart. He did not alter course. He held steady, letting the distance close. It was a test of nerve. He was wagering that the opposing pilot would break first when faced with a Mustang charging head-on. At 200 yards, the Tojo pilot flinched. He pulled hard to the left, trying to avoid a collision. That was the opening. The maneuver exposed the engine. Shomo squeezed the trigger. The 6 machine guns thundered. The Tojo flew straight into the stream of fire. The engine block shattered. The propeller tore free and spun off into the gray sky. The fighter stalled almost instantly, hanging in place for a fraction of a second before dropping away. 3 destroyed. But the head-on pass had cost him speed. He was now slow and lower than he wanted to be. The remaining 2 Toyos were already turning, positioning themselves behind him. He had just expended his advantage. The energy situation had shifted against him. By pulling through the attack, he had bled off airspeed. His indicator hovered near 200 miles per hour in an aircraft that preferred 300. Behind him, 2 enemy fighters were closing rapidly. They had momentum. They had position. They carried cannons. He had 2 options. He could drop the nose and attempt to run, dragging the weight of his camera equipment in a desperate race toward the tree line. Or he could commit to a close fight in a machine not built for it. He checked his mirror. The lead Tojo was settling into firing position, propeller spinning like a bright circle just 500 yards behind him. He pushed the throttle fully forward, not to escape, but to maneuver. Then he hauled back on the stick and drove his left rudder pedal down. The Mustang protested. The heavy camera assemblies in the rear swung with the force of the turn. The aircraft did not simply bank. It snapped. He forced the F-6D into a rolling scissors, a tight corkscrewing maneuver intended to force a pursuing aircraft to overshoot. It was a tactic better suited to lighter fighters, not a reconnaissance aircraft burdened with equipment. The airframe shook violently. The instrument panel blurred. Metal groaned under stress. The Japanese pilot had not expected resistance. He was approaching too fast, eager to finish the fight. As Shomo tightened his turn under heavy G-forces, the Tojo could not reduce speed quickly enough. It slid past his canopy, so close he could see oil streaks along its fuselage. In an instant, roles reversed. Shomo snapped the stick to the right, reversing direction. The Mustang's nose swung around. He did not wait for perfect alignment. He aimed ahead of where the Tojo would be and pressed the trigger. Tracers walked into the cockpit. The rounds shattered the canopy and struck the pilot. The fighter jerked upward briefly, then stalled and fell away into the clouds. For destroyed. The last Tojo witnessed his wingman fall and reacted with panic. He broke sharply right and dove toward the cloud layer, hoping the mist would conceal him from the heavier American aircraft. Shomo was already descending. He pushed the nose down and let gravity assist. The Mustang accelerated rapidly. In the dive, the weight that had hindered him in climbs now worked in his favor. Mass translated into momentum. He descended on the fleeing fighter with increasing speed. Just as the Tojo reached the edges of the clouds, Shomo closed in. The Japanese pilot jinked left and right, attempting to throw off his aim. Shomo ignored the erratic movements and aimed at the center of the aircraft. He fired a controlled burst. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore through the tail section. Control surfaces failed. The aircraft lost stability, pitched forward, and plunged into the jungle at full speed. 5 destroyed. The fighter vanished into the trees without a fireball, only a violent burst of shattered branches and dirt rising from the jungle. 5 destroyed. Shomo pulled the Mustang up and dragged in a breath. The cockpit reeked of hot oil, burned powder, and sweat. His flight suit clung to him. His forearms shook from fighting the controls. He glanced at his clock. Not even 3 minutes since the first trigger squeeze. 5 aircraft in less than 3 minutes. He had just become an ace in a single engagement, and it had happened before most pilots finished their morning coffee. Many men flew entire tours without ever seeing 5 enemy planes. Shomo had eliminated half a squadron in minutes. But the sky was not clear yet. The real objective was still moving. He scanned ahead and found the Betty. While he had been dismantling its escorts, the bomber had dropped lower and was running. It skimmed just above the treetops, hugging the terrain, banking around ridges to blend into the dark green canopy. The pilot knew what he was doing. He was heading toward friendly anti-aircraft cover. Shomo rolled into pursuit and pushed the throttle forward again. The engine temperature needle crept into the red. Manifold pressure was beyond safe limits. He was demanding everything from the Packard-built Merlin. The engine protested with a harsh roar, but it responded. The gap began to shrink. The bomber was not a fighter. It carried defensive guns. As Shomo closed from the rear, the tail position came alive. A 20mm cannon opened fire. These were not light machine gun rounds. They were explosive shells. One hit in the engine would end the flight. One hit in the cockpit would end his life. He saw the muzzle flashes. He watched the glowing tracers drifting toward him. He did not weave widely. Wide evasive moves would bleed speed, and he needed speed to overtake the bomber. Instead, he made small corrections with the rudder, subtle enough to disrupt the gunner's aim without sacrificing momentum. Shells cracked past his wings, snapping through the air. That cannon had to be silenced. At 400 yards, he fired a brief test burst. The tracers fell short, dropping beneath the bomber's tail. He raised the nose slightly. He fired again. This time the round struck the turret. Glass shattered. The cannon stopped. The tail gunner was no longer firing. Shomo held full power and continued closing. He moved his fire along the fuselage, watching pieces of metal tear free and the fabric of the rudder disintegrate. The Betty kept flying. Now he was so close that if the bomber detonated, he would have little room to escape. He ignored the risk. He shifted aim to the right engine and held the trigger down. All 6 guns hammered. The entire airframe vibrated as he poured hundreds of rounds into the nacelle. The engine did not simply quit. It exploded. A fierce white fire erupted from the cowling. The propeller tore loose and spun away. Flames spread into the wing tank almost instantly. The right wing ignited and began to fail. The structure collapsed. The bomber rolled violently toward the dead engine and smashed into the jungle. A towering fireball rose, thick smoke billowing upward. The blast shook Shomo's canopy as he passed overhead. The bomber was gone. 6 destroyed. He banked sharply and checked behind him, expecting clear sky. It was not empty. One final fighter remained. Alone Tony had stayed high, concealed in the clouds, waiting for Shomo to focus on the bomber. It was a patient ambush. The Japanese pilot dove out of the sun, guns already firing. Rounds struck Shomo's wing, punching clean holes through aluminum. He did not think. He reacted. He hauled the Mustang into a tight left turn, pulling so hard that the edges of his vision dimmed. The weight of the camera equipment strained the airframe. The Tony tried to follow but carried too much speed from his dive. He overshot wide. That mistake was fatal. Shomo chopped the throttle and dropped his flaps. The Mustang decelerated sharply. The enemy fighter slid past, unable to slow in time. Shomo retracted the flaps, rammed the throttle forward, and settled in behind him. He was exhausted. His grip cramped on the control stick. Sweat burned his eyes. But he would not let this one escape. This was the last escort, the final witness. The Japanese pilot sensed the danger and tried everything. He dove. He twisted. He attempted to shake the Mustang from his tail. It did not work. Shomo closed to 50 yards. Close enough to see the pilot turning his head, searching behind him. He pressed the trigger. Nothing. Silence. A cold shock ran through him. He had fired thousands of rounds in minutes. Had he emptied the ammunition? He was perfectly lined up at point-blank range, and his guns had fallen quiet. He flipped the gun selector off and back on. He glanced at the circuit breakers. All indicators were normal. Either the weapons had jammed, or he had finally emptied the belts. He swore under his breath and struck the instrument panel with his palm. The jolt must have shaken something loose. Or perhaps the feed motors simply caught again. He squeezed the trigger once more, holding his breath. The guns answered. It had only been a brief interruption. The tracers reached forward again and struck the Tony squarely in the fuselage. The cockpit shattered. The aircraft snapped downward, cartwheeling through the air before smashing into a flooded rice field. 7 destroyed. Shomo pulled the Mustang into a steep climb, rising above the burning jungle. He scanned the sky carefully. Left, right, above, below, nothing. The formation of 13 aircraft had vanished. In just minutes, the reconnaissance pilot had erased an entire Japanese strike group. Somewhere below, Lieutenant Lipscomb was finishing off 3 stragglers that had tried to escape. For Shomo, the engagement was over. He leveled at 4,000 feet and eased the throttle back, letting the Merlin cool. The wind noise softened. Beneath him, 7 columns of black smoke climbed from the jungle canopy. 7 markers. He reached for the radio. His hand shook now as the adrenaline drained away. He pressed the transmit button. "Lipscomb, you all right?" His wingman replied breathlessly that he was fine and had accounted for 3 enemy aircraft. "Good work," Shomo said quietly. "Let us head home. We have what we need." He turned south toward Mindoro. The cameras in the rear fuselage were still intact, heavy and unused. He had not exposed a single reconnaissance frame. The only film that mattered now was in the gun camera. That footage would speak for itself. The flight back felt unreal. His hands trembled on the controls. His uniform was soaked. The steady drone of the engine filled the cockpit, but his mind replayed the dive, the gunfire, the explosions. He kept checking his mirrors, half expecting fighters to appear behind him. None did. When his wheels touched the steel planking at Hill Field, it was an ordinary landing to the mechanics on the ground. Aircraft returned every day. Pilots stepped out tired, irritated, hungry. They had no idea that the plane taxiing and carried proof of something extraordinary. He shut down the engine. The propeller slowed and stopped, ticking as the metal cooled. The silence that followed was heavy. He unfastened his harness and climbed out onto the wing. His legs felt unsteady. The crew chief hurried over, ready to ask about weather conditions and photographs. Then he paused. The wing gun ports were blackened. The red fabric patches that had covered the muzzles before takeoff were gone, torn away. Powder stains marked the metal. Jagged holes from enemy fire scarred the skin of the aircraft. The chief looked up and asked if he had encountered trouble. Shomo nodded and raised 7 fingers. The chief misunderstood at first. Perhaps he had seen 7 enemy planes. Perhaps he had fired 7 bursts. The idea of 7 victories in one mission did not register. Pilots did not shoot down 7 aircraft in a single sortie. Even the leading aces of the Pacific added to their scores gradually over months of combat. 7 in one engagement sounded like exaggeration. The doubt followed him into the debriefing room. An intelligence officer sat with pencil ready, expecting a routine reconnaissance report. When Shomo stated the count, 1 bomber and 6 fighters destroyed in under 6 minutes, the officer stopped writing. He studied Shomo, then Lipscomb, then the clock on the wall. The numbers seemed impossible. The timeline was too short. The officer cautioned him about overstating claims. False victories distorted records and dishonored others. He spoke as if addressing a young pilot trying to impress his peers. The old label still hung there. Tourist. No one doubted he had been in combat. The bullet holes across his Mustang proved that. But 7 victories? That sounded absurd. Shomo did not protest. He did not raise his voice or demand belief. He had spent years preparing the dead. He understood that evidence carried more weight than emotion. He told the intelligence officer to process the film. Each time he had pressed the trigger, the gun camera mounted in his wing had activated automatically. It was synchronized with the weapons. It recorded exactly what the guns recorded. That was the witness that mattered. The development tent was cramped and hot, thick with the smell of chemicals. Technicians worked in near darkness, feeding long strips of film through trays of developer and fixer. Shomo waited outside with the intelligence officer, who stood with folded arms, ready to document what he assumed would be an inflated claim. When the film dried, it was loaded into a projector. The lights went out. The screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, black and white, vibrating from the recoil of the guns. But it was unmistakable. The first Tony filled the frame and then vanished in flame. The second tore apart under concentrated fire. A Tojo stalled and dropped away. The Betty bomber appeared next, tracers climbing along its fuselage, the right engine erupting, the wing folding before the aircraft crashed into the jungle. The final Tony shuddered as rounds struck the cockpit and disappeared below. 7 separate kills. No commentary. No exaggeration. Just mechanical destruction captured frame by frame. When the film leader flapped against the projector, the room remained silent. The intelligence officer sat motionless in the darkness. Doubt drained from his expression. Whatever label had followed Shomo into that room ended there. He was no tourist. Word spread rapidly. The report moved from squadron level to group command, then higher. Eventually, it reached General Douglas MacArthur. Command realized the situation immediately. A pilot who had just destroyed 7 aircraft in a single sortie was no longer just another officer on the roster. He had become a symbol. Allowing him to return to routine missions and risk being lost in an ordinary engagement would have been reckless. 12 days later, Major William Shomo was removed from combat duty. He was grounded and sent back to the United States. He received the Medal of Honor. The citation described the odds he faced, the decision to attack, and the execution of the engagement. But the decoration was not what set him apart. The record did. In the entire history of air combat, from the early biplanes of the First World War to modern jet fighters, no one has surpassed that single mission. Other pilots accumulated higher totals over time. Others flew longer tours. But no one became an ace in one mission faster than William Shomo. 7 victories in roughly 6 minutes. After the war, he did not seek attention. He did not build a public persona around that day. He continued working, first with the Air Force and later in the aerospace field, contributing to the development of new aircraft. He approached his 6 minutes of fame the same way he had approached his earlier profession, with restraint and respect. He understood that the smoke columns rising from the jungle had marked the end of 7 lives, not points on a scoreboard. The Mustang he flew was eventually scrapped. The cameras that had weighed it down disappeared into storage and scrap bins. But the story remained. It serves as a reminder that equipment alone does not create a combat pilot. Reputation does not determine outcome. Manuals provide guidance, not destiny. What matters is the decision made in a single moment. Shomo proved that a reconnaissance aircraft could become a weapon when flown by someone willing to act. He showed that dismissing an opponent can be fatal. If this account of the reconnaissance pilot who defied expectation held your attention, consider supporting the channel. Press the like button. It signals that these stories deserve to be heard. If you have not subscribed, join us. We continue to explore the lesser-known moments and individuals who shaped history through decisive action. History is not only dates and statistics. It is the roar of an engine at full power, the smell of burned powder, and the resolve of one man facing 13. We will see you in the next story.